Hi, in this video I want to talk about the South African military. I think the subject is really important because after the end of apartheid, a lot of people, including South Africans themselves, were hoping that the South African military would be able to serve as sort of a net exporter of security and stability in southern Africa and elsewhere on the African continent. And part of this has to do with the fact that the South African military has kind of a legacy reputation of excellence because of the state of the qualities that people associate with the apartheid era South African military. So the question is, how good is the South African military today? How much continuity is there really between the contemporary South African military and its apartheid era predecessor? And ultimately, can it do the job? And I think that most people seem to agree that actually, unfortunately, the South African military is really not fit for purpose. But I want to talk about that. My name is Michael Shirkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. Now, of course, if you like this video, please hit the like and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. It really, really helps my channel. It helps me keep doing what I've been doing. Also, before I start, I want to give a shout out to two of my biggest fans at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, Zach C. and AJ. So, thank you very much for watching. Also, I want to acknowledge the assistance that I got during this video from Richard Teixeira, who sent me a bunch of South African government defense review kinds of documents, which really kind of helped me get up to speed and kind of understand what the contemporary South African military is really all about. I also want to give a shout out to the website Defense Web, which is a South African focused defense website that's extremely helpful. There's a lot of really good material to be found on that website. I propose to organize this video into three sections, and I put timestamps in the description if you want to jump around. First, I'm going to talk about the South African military, the apartheid era South African military, which was known as the South African Defense Forces, or the SADF. Second, I want to talk about the transition from the SADF to the SANDF, the South African National Defense Forces. And the key dates for the transition are really, it's 1993 was the end of conscription. White males were conscripted for 2-year services during the apartheid era. And 1994, which was the formal end of apartheid, and then the emergence of the SANDF. So that's when officially the SANDF was born. Third, finally, I want to talk about the state of the SANDF today. So part one, let's talk about the apartheid era military, the SADF, the South African Defense Forces. I want to be really careful here because it's unfortunately too often the case that a certain category of people get really nostalgic about the SADF and I think romanticize it a bit as some sort of crack military outfit worthy of, I don't know, Sparta. What sort of category of people am I talking about? Well, frankly, racists. These are the same sort of people who, to be blunt, kind of jerk off over pictures of Rhodesian soldiers. So I want to be as objective as possible. I don't want to fall into that trap of saying, it was the greatest thing. However, I think that objectively speaking, it is fair to say that the SADF's reputation as a scrappy, innovative, and effective fighting force is well deserved. This should really come as no surprise. The SADF is, after all, the direct descendant of the British military, and for decades, it was designed basically to fight alongside the British military, so it's sort of up to a certain standard. And then in the 1970s and 1980s, the SADF found itself fighting many wars, fighting domestic insurgencies, but also fighting foreign adversaries on the other side of the borders. We're talking wars in Namibia, of course, in Angola, etc. So, this is a battle-hardened, experienced force. And if you look closely at a lot of what the SADF did, one can see lots of examples of doctrinal innovations and some real creativity and equipment innovation, etc. So it's an impressive outfit that did pretty well. Also, one of the interesting parts about the history of the SADF is that there was an arms embargo for a while, for I think at least 20 years, that prevented the SADF from buying modern equipment, which meant that the SADF had to, well, first of all, they had to develop an indigenous defense industry, which still exists today and is quite sophisticated, but also it meant that the South Africans had to take their old equipment and modernize it and develop it, change it, make it still useful. And I think that in a way the embargoes actually kind of made it scrappier and made it more creative, right? Because they had to be more inventive in order to have the kinds of capabilities that they needed without being able to buy things on the international market. Now, there are some very good books written about this period. I recommend Eben Barlow's book, Composite Warfare. There's also Willem, I don't know how to pronounce any of these names, Willem Steenkamp or Willem Steenkamp. I have no idea how to pronounce Afrikaans. His book, South African Border Wars, 1966-1989. I'll put some links to these books in the description. There are a lot more, and I think that the SADF's war record is sufficiently interesting and rich to merit serious scholarly consideration. And so there's some good people who've done some really good work sort of looking at, for instance, their doctoral innovations, etc., all without kind of falling into that trap of sort of the sort of becoming nostalgic for the racism of the apartheid regime, etc. Now, for our purposes, however, what I want to say what I want to highlight about the SADF are really two things, and these are things that I think are relevant for our later discussion about the SANDF. The first thing about the SADF, and part of what made it as good as it was funding. The apartheid-era South Africa in the 1970s, 1980s spent about 4 to 5% GDP on defense. How much was that? Well, in 1980, for example, South Africa's GDP was roughly $89 billion, or from what I've been able to find, $135 billion in today's dollars. I hope I've got these numbers right. Now, this works out to about $3.5 to $4.5 billion back in 1980, or $5.4 billion to $6.8 billion in 2025 dollars. Now, remember these numbers because today's SANDF spends a lot less money, both as a proportion of GDP and in real dollar terms. What this money bought in the 1970s and 1980s was a 70,000 strong conscript force with 3 well-developed branches with a broad range of joint military capabilities and an impressive inventory of domestically developed or modified weapons systems. These included armored vehicles, attack helicopters, and even fighter jets. There was something called the Cheetah, which was a really kind of a South African variant of the Israeli Kafir, which is basically a modernized Mirage 3. And I think that the modernized and modified systems that the South Africans cooked up on their own had the virtue of all being tailor-made for South African military requirements. So they're interesting things to look at, and from what I understand, by and large, these things that the South Africans did, where they took their older pre-embargo systems and they modernized them and updated them, were really actually quite effective. The second advantage that the SADF had, and is I don't think that this can be overstated, is clarity of purpose. In other videos, I've talked about this. I've talked about how countries that have a clear sense of what their militaries are for have an easier time designing an appropriate force, determining their requirements, the real requirements, which means they have an easier time prioritizing, figuring out what they need to spend money on, what they don't need to spend money on, what they need and what they don't need. Countries that are clear, that have this kind of clarity of purpose, I think tend to get better bang for the buck. Now, in contrast, countries that don't have this kind of clarity of purpose tend to spin their wheels or go around in circles. They have a harder time prioritizing, figuring out what they need, what they don't need. They're more wasteful. They get less bang for the buck. And this is certainly something that the apartheid era South African military really benefited, I think, from this real sense of clarity. They knew what their job was, which was defending the republic against domestic and foreign adversaries. The foreign adversaries were real. They knew who the enemy was, etc. This makes it easier to design a force and to prioritize and to figure out what their requirements are. Okay, so now part 2 of the video, which is the transition from the SADF to the SANDF. There are several things that happened during the transition period that had a negative effect on the force and reduced the continuity between the SADF and the SANDF. The first, most obvious thing is funding. The South African government cut defense spending in between 1989 and 1997 by about 50%. The decline continued into the 21st century, such that by 2015, spending was about 1.1% GDP. In 2022, it had dropped to 0.74% GDP. And in 2011, I saw that South Africa spent about $4.59 billion on defense. In 2022, it spent about $3 billion on defense. And as far as I can tell, the 2024 defense budget was about $2.8 billion, or 0.73% of GDP. Now, as a defense hawk, I might deplore this and say this is a really bad thing. These budget cuts are really bad. But it's really important to recall, I mean, I think that we need to have a certain amount of empathy with respect to the plight of the South African military. We have to recall that South Africa, after apartheid, faced and continues to face no external security threats and has many more pressing socioeconomic needs. It has better things to do with its money. So, we need to mitigate our criticism with that awareness in mind, right? It's all about priorities. What are the priorities? Now, the second thing, besides funding, that happened during this transition period was what we can basically call integration and affirmative action. Now, I want to be really careful here because I do not want to imply that integration and affirmative action are intrinsically bad things. And we absolutely have to keep in mind that South Africa, in the immediate aftermath of the end of apartheid, had certain things it needed to do. When you're going from apartheid to democracy, among other things, you have to reforge the relationship between the state security services, including the SANDF, and society at large. It also meant that you have to change the composition of the state security services so that they better reflect the larger society. I strongly believe that these are imperatives. These are very good for all democracies to have, and this is true for all countries, all democratic countries. I think that this is a really, really important thing. And when you think about sort of the situation in South Africa, 1994, the end of apartheid, you could see how this is really important. They need to do this. And given that there are no external threats, not really, this is actually a greater requirement. It's a greater priority than, say, thinking strictly in terms of military capabilities. So, things happen, but I don't want to say they were necessarily a bad thing or that they were unnecessary. They had to happen. They had to take place. Although there's a downside to what they did. One of the things that this meant was that, first of all, the transition, like in real terms, one of the things that the South African military had to do as part of this transition in the 1990s was to integrate thousands of soldiers from what they call, I believe, non-statutory armed groups. I'm thinking about soldiers who were parts of, there are all sorts of like local militia, local security forces, plus the armed wings of some of the anti-apartheid groups like the African National Congress. These are people who previously had been at war with the SADF. And I cannot stress enough how difficult this is to do, to take former enemies with very different backgrounds, very different cultural backgrounds, very different kinds of training, very different kinds of promotion backgrounds, et cetera, and weld them together into a cohesive and effective force. So it's not about these people being good, these people being bad, or anything like that. This is just a Herculean task. This is really very difficult to do. Among other things, this means that these soldiers don't necessarily want to take orders from one another, and that's a problem. I've heard that this is one of the things that spurred the exodus of a lot of experienced white soldiers. It's sort of like, you don't necessarily want to hang out with or take orders from people that you used to be fighting, or people who have very different kinds of professional backgrounds as you do. Other thing that integration did was it meant that the South African National Defense Forces staffing levels, their manning levels, were too high, particularly given that they were slashing the defense budget by, as I said before, at least 50%. In order to right-size the force, they had to shed a lot of people. Among the ways the South African military did this was by offering retirement packages. And one thing that this did was this gave an out for a lot of the older, experienced white soldiers and officers. The problem isn't that you're replacing white people with non-white people. The problem is that you're losing people with experience, and particularly given the fact that the SADF had been at war through the 70s and 80s, a lot of these people had really very good experience. So a lot of experienced people fled. And from what I've read, this includes much of the top brass, plus people who were in charge of the combat regiment. So a lot of really good people with skills and expertise simply left. The third thing that happened as part of this integration is that there's a problem that is a new problem that's familiar to us Americans, which is how do you actually manage diversity? The South African government, for very reasonable political reasons, decided that it wasn't enough to simply attempt to have a colorblind recruitment and colorblind promotion. What they wanted to do was speed up the process by which the military would resemble the larger society, which meant, among other things, promoting a lot of non-whites into higher ranks, ranks that the whites had dominated previously. Now, one of the downsides to this, and an obvious catch, is that sometimes this meant being forced to decide about lowering standards, right? So you have the imperative of affirmative action for very sound political reasons, and then you've got the catch of, well, in order to do this, maybe you need to cut standards, lower standards. And the South African government decided at the time that cutting standards, lowering standards was necessary, and that was the right choice to make. We can bemoan the effect that this might have had on the quality of the force, but at the same time, given the circumstances in the 1990s and the larger political needs of the day, this really makes perfect sense. And I don't want to say that they made the wrong call. Like this, it all makes perfect sense. And, again, we just need to remember what were the real needs of the South African government and needs of this fledgling democracy in the 1990s. And this is what they elected to do. And I don't think it's appropriate to second guess this decision. Lastly, the last part of the transition period that I want to refer to, the last change, was the lack of clarity, or the loss of clarity. The apartheid era SADF was busy fighting wars. Those wars came to an end. So, with the end of the wars, there's no longer a clear threat. There's no longer a clear purpose. And so the South African military lost the clarity that it benefited from during the apartheid era. So this is another problem. Okay, so finally we get to part 3, which is the SANDF itself. Now, the SANDF today is fairly large. It's got about 71,000 people in it. It's also very busy. There are about 3,000 SANDF soldiers serving in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There's about 1,000 of them, just over 1,000 serving in Mozambique. These duties, these deployments are not picnics. Just last January, 13 or 14, I'm not sure, SANDF soldiers were killed in eastern Congo fighting the M23 rebel group. So, these are combat operations. The first question, though, I think to ask about the SANDF is, what is it even for? Officially, its mandate is, quote, to enhance and contribute to peace, security, and stability in the Republic of South Africa, in the region, and in Africa, in the world, through appropriately resourced and sustained defense capabilities. The intention is for the SANDF to fulfill all sorts of goals and missions. And here, I'm showing you a chart that I got from a relatively recent South African Defense Review document. And the chart is actually very hard to read, but I think that's kind of part of the point, because when I look at this chart, I think, oh my God, like this is a sort of confusion. It's really very muddled. And I look at this and I think that the South African military is not really clear about what it needs to do and how to actually prioritize. This is just like a muddled document, and I think that the muddled document reflects muddled thinking. It's understandable, given that, again, there's no more external threat, the country's no longer at war, but it's struggling to figure out, well, what exactly does it need to do, and what exactly does it need to have, and what requirements does it need to meet, etc. Here's another document that from the same source that I find very revealing. I mean, what even does this mean? I don't really understand this. This chart is very hard to read. And I strongly doubt that the South African military did not make charts like this in the 1970s, again, because it had this kind of clarity of purpose that is just no longer there. In practice, I think what this all means is that the SANDF, although it doesn't really have a clear vision, sort of aspires to be a do-anything, flexible force capable of the full spectrum of operations, although in reality, most of the time its focuses on peacekeeping missions under flags of either the UN or the African Union or something called the South African Development Community or the SADC. It wants to be able to project force in order to provide stability, to manage crises, etc. Hence the current deployments in the Democratic Republic of Congo and in Mozambique. And in the past, the South African National Defense Forces have deployed to Sudan, Burundi, Central African Republic, Lesotho, Comoros Islands, Rwanda, Liberia, Ethiopia, Ivory Coast, and Uganda. None of this, by the way, requires conventional military capabilities. It's mostly about fighting irregular forces, asymmetrical warfare, counterterrorism operations. It requires mobility and logistics, but not necessarily firepower, or at least not necessarily a lot of firepower. Secondarily, the SNDF needs naval capabilities to protect its exclusive zone and to ensure access to the sea. This is something that does come up in the South African Defense Review documents that I've read. So there's this idea that the Army needs expeditionary peacekeeping and coin capabilities and counterterrorism capabilities, while the Navy needs basically legitimate blue water Navy type capabilities. Okay, so can the SANDF do these things? On paper, yes, but in reality, no. So on paper, the SNDF is large enough. It's got about 71,000 people, men and women on active duty. The Army has about 37,000 people in it. I think it's and it has, when you look at sort of the inventory, like what has it got? It seems to have kind of all the things that the South African military needs to be able to do. So, for instance, the Army has a very impressive fleet of armored vehicles, with the bulk of it consisting of MRAPs, APCs, infantry fighting vehicles. And I would say that arguably the real workhorse of the South African Army is this thing called the RG-31 Nyala, which is an MRAP, which has there are almost 1,000 of them in the South African fleet. By the way, many of you probably already know this, but the MRAP, the mine resistant, it's an American term, it's like the mine resistant armored protection or something like that, was itself invented by the Rhodesians in the late 1970s and then perfected by the South African military during the 1980s. And I think all MRAPs today are basically the direct descendants of the SADF's MRAPs, things like this Buffel or Buffel MRAP that they had for a while, and I think they still have some. Also of note, you've got really interesting vehicles like the Littell or Rato. Again, forgive me, I don't really know how to pronounce Afrikaans, designed in the late 1960s to meet the requirements of the SADF's mobile warfare doctrine. I've read that there are maybe 300 in the SANDF inventory, and they are, from what I've read, they were extremely useful during the so-called Bush Wars or border wars. The SANDF, by the way, also has some main battle tanks. It has 74 Oliphant tanks, which were developed in the 1970s based on British Centurion tanks. Again, so what they would do is they would take this old thing and they would modernize it and adapt it in order to keep it current, despite the fact that essentially it's a very old pre-embargo thing. Except for the chassis, the Centurion chassis, all of the components of this tank, the Oliphant, are relatively modern, and they're South African made. They're made by the indigenous defense industry. I also want to point out that South Africa has excellent locally manufactured howitzers. The principal South African towed artillery howitzer is the 155 millimeter Denel G5 Leopard. Denel is like now the main South Africa defense firm, and there's also something called there's a self-propelled version called the G6. The G5 and the G6, from what I understand, are based on the Canadian GC-45, which was the brainchild of the now infamous Canadian artillery cannon designer Gerald Bull. And so the G5 is a GC-45 that's been modified even a little bit more, plus it uses ammunition that's been modified, and so it has Gerald Bull's fingerprints all over it. Gerald Bull was sort of like the Werner von Braun of artillery, in that he didn't really care whom he was working for as long as somebody was giving him money to do the kinds of things that he was passionate about, which is basically making better and better artillery and artillery cannon and artillery rounds. Of course, so he's happy to build stuff for Canada. I think he made some stuff for the Chinese, South Africa, Saddam Hussein's Iraq. In fact, the thing that Gerald Bull is best known for is this project he was doing for Saddam Hussein called the Big Babylon. The idea was a gigantic gun that was large enough to put satellites into low orbit and hit with shells targets 5,000 kilometers away. Bull, by the way, was assassinated, and everybody thinks that Mossad is the one that killed him because of this Iraqi project, although from what I've read, there are a lot of people who had an interest in killing him. So maybe Mossad did it, maybe others, who knows? I don't really know. South Africa's Denel firm also has developed recently a new self-propelled howitzer called the T552, which it made for the Indian market. It's basically the G5 mounted on a more modern Czech Tatra truck chassis. From what I could tell, it's more fully automated than the old G6 self-propelled howitzer, and thus can be deployed faster, has a higher rate of fire, and I'm going to guess it's roughly equivalent to something like the French Caesar self-propelled howitzer. Speaking of Denel, the standard service weapon for the South African Army is still Denel's Vector R5, which is basically a modified version of the Israeli Galil rifle. Okay, so far so good, right? Like, this all sounds good. Now, while I could not find any real precise data about this, all the available information strongly suggests that a large portion of all the equipment that I've mentioned above is inoperable because it's just broken down, and the South Africans just are not keeping these things in repair. It's a question of money, and it's a question of training, and all of this is about budget constraints, really. The problem becomes even more evident when we look at the Air Force and South Africa's combat aircraft, which on paper represent a very potent force. So the SANDF now, they got rid of the cheetahs, and then they now have a force of 26 Saab Gripen fighters. They're great, modern. However, from what I've read, only 2 or 3 of them actually work. They also have 24 BAE Hawk Mk-120s, which are training/light attack aircraft. But again, only 2 or 3 of them are operational. I think the most interesting combat aircraft that the SANDF has is their attack helicopter. It's a locally developed Denel helicopter called Rooiwak. It's basically, development began in the 1980s in order to meet the growing needs for conventional warfare capabilities. Like a lot of South African stuff, it's an old pre-embargo thing that they updated and updated again and again and again. So the base thing is a French-built Puma that at some point they turned into something called the Oryx, and then in the 80s they turned some of these Oryxes into these Rooiwak attack helicopters. The Rooiwak, apparently only 4 of them are operational. They still have 39 Oryx in service, although who knows how many of them are operational, probably really very few. And then they have a bunch of other helicopters, Westland helicopters, etc., etc. All of them suffer from the same problem, that they might have 30 in their fleet, but only 2 or 3 of them actually work. This really matters because the SANDF, given the kinds of geography that they operate in, expeditionary operations are operating in very large areas like Eastern Congo, you need mobility and you need firepower, mobile firepower. So if your aircraft don't work, if you can't provide air support, then you're in trouble. So apparently one of the reasons that I read that South African soldiers got killed recently in Eastern Congo was that there was no air support available for them. The South Africa was not able to deploy any of its Rooiwak attack helicopters to Eastern Congo because too few of them are actually operable. There's also the problem where if very few of your aircraft are operational, this means that your pilots can't spend enough hours in the plane training and keeping up their skills to remain qualified for flight. I've read that in a recent report that the Air Force has a target of 12,000 flight hours a year, and they're supposed to have it over like the next 3 years, but it can't really do that, and it only flew 6,904 hours, so there's only half the target number of flight hours in 2023-2024. So pilots are failing to qualify. They're failing enough to get enough flight time to keep up their skills. The South African Army does, by the way, operate an impressive array of drones. They are all, or most, or probably all home-brewed, manufactured by Denel or a company called Milcor. At least 2 of these drone types can be armed. I do not know if any of them are armed, nor do I know if enough of them are operational such that they're of use in places like Eastern Congo or Mozambique. Like, are they operating these drones in these zones? I'm under the impression that they're not. Now, turning to the South African Navy, we see a similar problem. The Navy did buy in the 2000s new stuff, new warships, surface ships and submarines. And these are very capable warships and submarines that they purchase, but very few of them are operational. So, for example, the South African Navy has 4 Valor-class guided missile frigates. These are German-built that date from the 2000s. They're very good. Only one of them is operational. There are 3 Heroine-class attack subs. I don't know how many of those are operational. These also are German-made. They are a variant of something called the Type 209, the 209. Also, they date from the late 2000s. And they have some offshore patrol vessels, but I was not able to find out how many of them there are. Now, as with the Air Force, the Navy spends very little time at sea because so few of the ships are operational. So, for instance, I read that they have a target of 8,000 hours at sea for each of the next 3 years. But in 2024, they were only able to do 2,641 hours. This is bad for crew cohesion, bad for crew skills. This is sort of bad. And so arguably, like, the Navy and the Air Force are almost in this sort of downward spiral, this vicious sort of almost a death spiral of skill and competency. And some of the things I read suggest basically the Air Force and the Navy, for all intents and purposes, are not really operable. As you can see already, I think the problem with this SANDF ultimately is funding. Its on paper strength is not what it should be, or rather, its on paper strength is impressive, but off paper, it's not. It's weak, and it cannot do the jobs that are assigned to it. And ultimately, the lack of money is the real culprit. So it's not about the integration or the affirmative action or anything like that. It's just that there's not enough money for these things to do the jobs that they're assigned to do. The situation, reportedly, is not going to change anytime soon. According to a press piece that I read dated 20 March 2025, the defense budget for 2025 is set to increase by 0.78%. But given that inflation is 3%, this is tantamount to a net decline. Another report said that the South African budget will be about $3 billion, or 0.8% of GDP. Is all of this really a problem? Given that South Africa doesn't face any real military threats, you can argue that no, it's not. It's not a problem. And the country has other priorities. I mean, there are all sorts of socioeconomic problems in South Africa. So the argument that it's got better things to do with its money, I think, is a really valid one. The problem is not, so like intrinsically, in and of itself, this isn't really a problem. It is a problem, though, in that there's a mismatch between South Africa's ambition, which is to sort of be this regional force and to export stability and security, and the means that it's consecrating for this task. So it's a mismatch between ambition and means, which is a familiar problem, something that a lot of countries have. Either the government has to scale down its ambitions and stop doing all these peacekeeping deployments, or increase spending, and perhaps both. It looks so far that the South African military is really choosing the worst possible option, which is that it's not scaling down its ambition and it's not increasing its defense spending. So this is really the worst thing to do. Is the SANDF, South Africa's military, any good? I have to answer no, not really. And the main problem is simply money. The South African government does not spend enough money on defense for the South African military to meet the ambitions that the South African government itself is setting. It's the deploy with bad equipment, with bad training, inadequate support, etc. Is there much continuity between the SANDF and its apartheid-era predecessor, the SADF? I'm inclined to say that there really isn't much continuity, ultimately because of the loss of experience, the rapid loss of experienced personnel in the 1990s, and the government's decision to accelerate diversification at the expense of sort of the operational qualities or sort of of military requirements. Again, I can't say that was the wrong call to make, given the political needs of the time and the political needs of the country. I don't think that was a mistake. I think that they did what they had to do, and it makes perfect sense. But I do feel like as a result, while the SADF still has this kind of almost a halo or this reputation of excellence, I don't really see it in the SANDF. The continuity issue has to do with the manpower, human resources, but then into the modern period, now we're into the third decade of the 21st century, now ultimately the problem is money. There's just not spending enough money. The last thing I want to say, though, in terms of the negative qualities of the SANDF is then again this lack of clarity and mission set. The SADF, I think, really benefited from the clarity that it had at the time. The SANDF has much more of a muddled vision, and that is one thing that's probably why they get away with spending so little, because there's no there's no sense of imperative, like, oh my God, we got to spend more money because we have security problems. The security problems don't exist. So how do you argue for spending more money when you have all these other priorities? And then in terms of how you spend your money, if you don't have real clarity, then I think there's this problem of having a hard time prioritizing about what you spend your money on. So that's it. If you like this video, again, please hit like and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next video. There's more in the pipeline. The next video that I'm working on is an explainer of French nuclear deterrence theory, nuclear deterrence doctrine, so a very different kind of video. Also, check out in my the description, I put links to my Twitter account, my LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and also to my own Substack, which I also call Pax Americana. I post there weekly. And that's it. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Bye-bye.